Before we do that, does anybody have any Bible questions?
I'd like to make a statement.
Okay.
Did anybody see the news this week about some birds?
Birds?
Birds, yeah.
I don't think
I somewhere. And they was talking about the bird was acting funny.
Oh, no, I don't.
Yeah. You heard it, yeah. And that I tried to tell people that once before that in that hot country, the grapes and everything would start fermenting before they take it off the tree, and that's what happened. The birds was eating those grapes and stuff, and they were fermenting, and so they was getting drunk.
Oh man.
So I was trying to tell somebody that before, and over there in what's called, I had read a piece about that in book of mine that during this time in Jerusalem, during this time when they had a controversy about wine and juice, that before they could get the grapes off the vine, they was already being fermented.
Huh.
Yeah. And there was too much controversy that was going on about Jesus didn't make real wine and all that. It was grape juice and all this stuff. So
yeah, that's what it says here.
A lot of times we got to do a deeper study and things. So when I heard that, I said, I wish everybody heard that.
So the headline is birds in Minnesota keep crashing into things, and police think it's because they're drunk.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
well,
it was
that's
ahead of time.
interesting.
Yeah, because of the weather, I think. Yeah.
I think sometimes, those times whenever whoever prepared the communion last left out the grape juice, and you kind of get a taste of that, the next week. They're flying and crashing into things. Apparently.
Yeah, they was the Jews in that equilibrium. What else will happen? What else is going on there? I just told you. They've been eating those grapes. They was fermented. They were getting fermented.
Maybe they tested the alcohol content in the grapes or something. I don't know.
Yeah, they're being fermented.
Oh well.
I know how I still fuck use the fermented buck and stuff, so I know how it is. I didn't taste it, but I just smell that's some horrible smell.
Well, I've got to say, by far, that was the most interesting Bible question we've ever got. I never knew that, though. Thanks for the information.
Yeah, I read that a long time ago.
All right. So, Esther, does anybody else have any other comments or questions? All right. So, to catch everybody up to speed, before we get into Esther chapter 5, what's happened so far is that this king of the Medo-Persian Empire had a wife, and he wanted to bring his wife in to sort of show her off before all of the men in this big banquet that they had, and she refused to do it. And so he banished her from his presence and selected a new queen. And the new queen that was selected was this young Jewish girl named Esther, who was an orphan, being raised by her uncle, and she was very beautiful. Well, Mordecai, after Esther becomes queen, Mordecai actually saves the king from a plot that conspiring to try to kill him. Johnny?
I think that was cousin. Cousin?
Yeah, it was cousin.
Was it his cousin?
Yeah, Mordecai was cousin.
His uncle's daughter.
His uncle's daughter. Okay. Let's see. Where's that at?
It should be in there. What verse is it?
I'm trying to find it right here now. Esther's cousin.
Chapter 2 is there. That'd be before the end, ain't it?
Yeah, chapter 2, verse 7.
Verse 7.
Oh, his uncle's daughter. Wait, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. Okay, it is his cousin. Uncle's daughter, I guess I was thinking about the uncle part. Well, anyways, she was being raised by her cousin, and he ends up saving the king at the end of chapter 2. Well, there was this man named Haman, and he was appointed a high position in the king's court, and he had everyone try to bow down before him. He was at the gate, but Mordecai wouldn't do it. And so this just drives Haman crazy, and every time he sees Mordecai, he just gets sick of the thought of him even being there. And so what Haman ends up doing is he conjures up this plot to have all of the Jews killed in the land of the Medes and Persians. And he's going to go to the king to have this done, and the king accepts it, not knowing that Esther herself was a Jew. And so here we have this, predicament where Esther the queen would even be killed because of this law. Whenever Mordecai learns about this plot and Esther figures out what's going on, they talk together, and what Mordecai tells Esther is, basically, you have a choice. This is in chapter 4 and verses 13 and 14. He tells her, do not imagine that you are going to escape do not imagine that you and the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you not come into the kingdom for such a time as this. And so this is the point where Mordecai basically says, don't fool yourself into thinking that you can escape just because you're the queen. You'll be killed because of this law too. And he tells her, you have a choice. You can either try to help deliver us from Haman's hands, or you can just be quiet and surely deliverance will come from another place. But then he asks this question, and this question is the basis for our entire study of Old Testament characters. Who knows whether or not you've come into the kingdom for such a time as this. So we're going to be looking at specific Old Testament characters in our study on Sunday mornings, and basically asking the question, why did they come into their time, or at that particular occasion? What did they do to progress God's plan of salvation on throughout history? Johnny?
Another thing you look at it that after Haman went to the king gave him a ring to seal, right? Whatever you want to do in the seal it.
Right.
Once that seal, can't nobody change that law. That law will stand.
That's right, and that's the same thing that happened with Daniel and Darius, right? In Daniel chapter 6, Darius made this law. Again, he was a Medo-Persian king as well. So it seems like those kings got tricked into making laws a lot of times. But anyways, he was tricked into making this law that you can't pray, and can't give thanks to anyone except for him. But Daniel continued to pray 3 times a day, and they had set that trap for him. But the thing about it is he couldn't change the law after he realized that law would lead to the death of one of his closest, I guess you'd say, friends or closest subjects, one of the highest men that was ranked in his kingdom. And so Haman does the same thing in the book of Esther. And so now Esther is going to intercede on behalf of the people to try and come up with some way to escape this judgment by the king. One of the things that Esther says at the end of Esther chapter 4 is in verse 16. She says, "Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." So in this tradition, if an individual wanted to go in before the king, he or she had to be invited. This was even included, a rule for the queen as well. But what could happen is, if the king would hold out his golden scepter, then they would be allowed in. If not, then they would perish. And so Esther looks at this situation and she says, well, if I perish, I perish. And we mentioned last week that this is the attitude that we need to try to have whenever we're facing, a conflict of whether to serve God or man, whether to serve him or our own desires. We should just say, if I perish, I perish, and be willing to go through anything on behalf of God or on behalf of each other as Christians. So, in chapter 5, Esther, she puts on her royal robes in verse 1. The scripture says here, "Now it came about on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, 'What is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be given to you.'" We pointed out last week how that's very similar to what happened with Herod and Herodias, right? He offered her half the kingdom, and she, of course, asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter. So, it's interesting, and we talked about this again last week. There's a lot of themes in the book of Esther that show up again in the New Testament. We have the 10,000 talents in the parable of forgiveness that Jesus gives in the book of Matthew, and the same thing is, or rather 10,000 talents was the price that was going to be put into the treasury for the execution of all these Jews that we learned about in chapter 4. And so there's a lot of references to Esther in the New Testament, or at least a lot of common themes. So Queen Esther is spared. The king accepts her into the palace, and he asks her, "What's troubling you?" And here's her request in verse 4. "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." So here we have in verse 6, he knew that there was more to this than just wanting to throw a banquet. And so he asks, "Okay, what do you really want? We know there's something behind all this food and wine." And here's what Esther replies in verse 8. "If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition to do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." So then Haman, he goes out in verse 9, and he has, the scripture says in verse 9, he went out that day glad and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. So here Haman goes out in good spirits, and yet there's Mordecai again, and it just burns him up inside. And so Haman, of course, he just cannot stand Mordecai. Have you ever had a situation where you maybe had a feud with someone at work or trouble with someone in your life or whatever it might be, and you were having a good day, but you saw that person and it just sort of ruined the whole thing? Well, we ought not to act like that, but that's just, sort of human nature. We behave like that sometimes. But here Haman's doing that with Mordecai, and we're about to see that kind of attitude and living will actually get you in a lot of trouble. Here's something that someone told me, and this might be some good advice. It's only applicable in some occasions. Obviously, it's not always going to be true, but someone only has as much power over you as you allow them to have. And Haman is giving Mordecai a whole lot of power, right? He is living in Haman's head rent-free, it seems. So Haman controlled himself, however, and went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons, and every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above the princes and the servants of the king. Haman also said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited by her with the king. Yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Haman, all he had to do was just fly under the radar at this point. Just sit back and accept all this glory and riches that was given to him, and he would have had a pretty good life. And yet he let this one thing just get under his skin. He says, "None of this satisfies me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." That's another lesson for us. Just because an individual has riches does not guarantee them happiness. You can be happy and have riches, but really happiness comes from within, not with things that you have on the outside. And Haman allowed these bad feelings of pride and things like that in this situation with Mordecai just destroy him. He had it all, everything someone could ask for at this time, short of being king himself, and yet he wasn't satisfied. So Zeresh and his wife and all of his friends, they come up with an idea for Haman. They tell him in verse 14, "Have a gallows 50 cubits high made and in the morning asked the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. So, in chapter 6, we have the king has a restless night. And again, this book is it's one of the best stories in the Bible. It's filled with drama and, plot, subplots and trickery and mischievousness and all this sort of things. And it's a nail biter. But here in chapter 6, the king that night, the scripture says, he could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai, what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, and that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So, this, of course, is not just coincidence. This is providence. And it was providential that the king had a restless night and asked for the Chronicles to be read to him. Ashley?
Just a curious question as far as translations, because I was looking at various ones, but I noticed the NIV and the NLT have basically, instead of a gallows, it basically says to have a pole sharpened, a 75-foot pole for Haman to be impaled on, opposed to being hanged on. I was just curious if you had any idea as to why, those versions would go with impaling versus hanging.
Let's see. I'm looking up some information on it now. Lonnie?
I was going to say, they really didn't build scaffold way back then during that time. They usually had something like, they'll go somewhere with a rope or hang over to hang somebody, like a tree limb or something else like that. So later on, I forgot when that was, maybe in the 1800s, they had to stop using scaffold.
Right.
All before, and sometime during the period, they put them in stock.
Right.
Like that. Or maybe they'll chop their head off.
Right.
All kind of ways. But
Right.
they didn't build what you call it. So that's probably why they use that word.
Yeah, let's see. Verse 14. Let me look it up real quick and see what the language is behind it. Okay, let's see. So the use of gallows for hanging bodies is mentioned frequently in Esther as a final act of disgracing Mordecai. It would end the battle of honor between the two enemies, with a defining win for Haman. Let's see. So the proposed height is sort of impractical. They say perhaps it wasn't taken to be literally, that it was literally going to be 50 cubits high, because that's 22 meters, about 22 yards high, which is kind of, that's a pretty high, whatever, what.
It was suggested that may have been suggested to kind of like display for all to see, essentially, what, like a flagpole, that type of situation.
Yeah, for the community
Right.
to see
Right.
it, that's all.
Yeah.
Put them up high for the community to see it. That's what the Romans did and all of this thing like that, crucified.
Right. So this information here says that it's not a hanging like we traditionally think, but it is an impalement.
Oh, okay.
So there, I guess the language there is just so similar. We just read into it what we typically think of, but really this is him, being impaled.
Yeah, it was just weird because I was looking at that when you were reading your version. I'm like, and then so I just looked at like 8 different comparisons real quick, and I think NIV and NLT
Right.
are the only two I know that actually use impaled. Everybody else is using gallows and
Probably.
hanging. So
During that time, you probably have to go back and do history on the Persian way of executing people at that time. As far as probably what we're talking about, like I agree with you, putting up gallows. They didn't have gallows back then.
Right.
So it probably been a standard way of executing people and impaling them.
yeah.
So the New American Standard has a footnote on the word gallows. It offers the alternate translation tree. So,
Limb and stuff.
right. So I know the King James Version says gallows, right?
Yes.
Okay. So our
That just like when in the book they use bottle instead of skin, you know, to put wine in.
Right.
So they use the word bottle, but the word's supposed to be translated skin.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I know that the Jehovah's Witnesses say that the cross should be translated pole or stake. Yeah. Huh. I've got a friend that actually thinks that too. That's not a Jehovah's Witness. Lonnie.
During that time, we don't even hear about anybody being hung or something like that. In the history, you know, a lot of times they said they put did whether it's forged or something like stuck them or something like that, and like the leader ran the nail through the man, stake through the man's head, and all stuff like that. They didn't have all that until later on. I guess they would call themselves getting sophisticated when they started crucifying and stuff like that.
Well, that was a custom. Again, you got to go back in history and start looking at the Roman customs on how they executed people.
Right.
They would hang them on a tree. Wasn't the way that we look at it as a cross. Wasn't the type of cross that we are used to. So some said it was like in an X. Some said it was just on a straight.
That's what Peter has.
Well, I've seen some depictions
Right.
depictions that it was a like a like a big block like that coming out of the ground, and then they had a crossbar that the person would actually bear. So when it says Jesus bore his cross, that he was bearing the crossbar, and they put him up there like that. But some of that stuff doesn't really change the importance of the whole story, and we get caught up on some of the details. Oh.
It's just like today, when they was they go take people to the gas chamber, they stopped there, now they want the electric. So during that time, the Romans hadn't even come into the picture. This is way back throughout the Babylonian captivity. Let's go back to the Neo-Persian. This time is when this is gotta be during
Persian time.
Well, they come out much later. Yep, it was Persian time, I think. Yeah, Persian time. It didn't say no Neo. It was Persian, I think it was doing this. But this to me, I had to go back and study this because something is wrong. Because when Esther was during the time of Nehemiah, right?
No.
I mean, not necessarily. It was.
The plum came out when they did this celebration. This book was done much later. It was doing Nehemiah, just before Nehemiah and Esther. These books are out of place, and so I got to go. Some reason.
I have a note that says it happened 30 years before Nehemiah was recorded. Even
Yeah,
though
so
the Bible comes after.
so it's by Nehemiah during the time that he went back and built the what you call it. But I think it was the Roman that was in what you call it. So I'm getting kind of confused. The Persians are in charge now. They're probably just before they were captain or something.
Right. So Jimmy, you go ahead.
What is the definition of impalement? I thought it would be like hung on a sword. That's what I
Or
thought.
pole.
Or pole,
Yeah,
yeah,
anything
sharp
like
pole.
that, opposed to a hanger. But the only reason I brought
I agree. I don't know that it matters, but I read it by NIV the other day, and I thought, what does that mean?
Yeah, impalement. I mean, yeah. But the reason I brought it up is just merely because if you're studying with somebody, it's good to know, because people try to dispute the Bible and say, oh, that kind of stuff. So it's good to know that these different words are different translations because people, so many different ones.
That was the meeting Persian time.
Right.
Yeah.
It was okay.
I know it
You
killed
see Cyrus comes out there. Cyrus come out there. And during Cyrus, that's when Nehemiah is sent back to rebuild the temple, right? Yeah. But before that, the Persians are defeated by the Greeks. Yeah.
Let's see. I'm trying to get it drawn out for you here. I think.
Well, you saying impaling is different from what you talking about on Jesus, how Jesus was executed.
Right.
Impaling is that it's just what it means. The person was impaled. It wasn't like a cross.
No.
It was more like a stake.
Right.
And it was run through the person.
Right.
Yep.
The person was
On it.
held by being the
Right.
stake being run through their body.
Right.
You talking about the cross and how Jesus was executed. He was nailed.
Right.
to hell.
Crucifixion.
So that was a different form.
Right.
That was a different form of execution.
Right.
Right. Right.
He
So.
basically died for suffocation, essentially. When you look at what crucifixion really is, they hang for so long until they can't breathe, essentially, is what.
A little weight of the body
Right.
drops down.
Yeah.
Can't breathe.
Right. So here's where we are. So in about 606 BC is whenever Babylon first went against Jerusalem, and they were eventually finally destroyed. For some reason, I cannot think of dates this morning, but I believe it was 586 BC when Jerusalem was finally destroyed. And so you had this war sort of. He went and attacked them 3 different times, 3 different sieges: 606, 596, or something, and 586. And so then after 7 years of captivity, you eventually get to this time in between 539 and 536, where a change of power takes place between the Babylon Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire. And so, let's see. So 536 is whenever Cyrus tells them to go, that he gives the charge for them to go back home. And then you have some other.
That wasn't 3 years later?
Right. They stayed in that area for about 3 years. Right. Well, there's several different. So he gives the original call for them to go back home in 536, but a lot of them didn't go back home for quite some time. Like whenever you read about Nehemiah and Ezra, that was later on than this time here. But
The 70 years was included with the Babylonian captivity.
For 70 years.
7 years was included with the Babylonian captivity.
right, so that's
Or was it?
606 to 536. They stayed in Babylon until 536. Nobody left,
Yeah,
go back to
yeah.
Judea until after that time. And so so what we're looking at, I don't know the exact date of Esther,
Right.
but we're looking some in this area
Right,
here.
right.
So that's where we are.
Right.
And I think actually her introduction to her Bible, I think, had offered us a suggestion for a specific date.
I read that somewhere too about the pole. They will hang them on a pole, and then in time, and they'll let the pole go through them gradually. They will sharpen the pole and then put them across.
Right. In terms of Judea, it was like 538.
Yeah, this is what this says. Sometime between 485 and 465, but 460. So I guess there's some debates about where the date is. So we're looking right around 460. We'll use Connie's date.
For Esther?
Right, for Esther.
Okay.
Yeah, because it was Xerxes, which is another name for that.
Ahasuerus, however you say it. Yeah. Well,
How you say it, lady?
in our Bible class, we said King A when I was.
Another name for that Xerxes.
Right, Xerxes, yeah.
But he ruled from 464 to 424.
All right. Well, it's about 460 BC. Sounds good to me. Let's look at chapter 6 now. So, chapter 6, we have King has a restless night, so he brings in the Chronicles to be read before him. And we have here in, let's see, verse 4. So he had asked the people, have we ever done anything for Mordecai? And they said, no, nothing's been done for him yet. And so the king says in verse 4, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. So he's just showed up to try to get the king to have Mordecai executed. And before he can even do anything, here's what happens in verse 5. The king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman says to himself, "Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?" Then Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let him bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king is ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let him array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on a horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to whom the king desires to honor.'" So Haman thinks that he's setting up a pretty good gig for himself here. And really, it's about the very man that he's come to have executed. And so the king says to Haman, "Take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said." Now Haman, he has to do this. This is the direct order from the king, and his life is on the line if he decides to not do it. So Haman, he takes the robes and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home mourning with his head covered. Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but surely will fall before him." Why do you think they said that?
So many things were going wrong. You wanted to do for one thing.
They know the history of the Jews.
Right, kind of like Rahab, right? So it seems to me though like they're trying to make up excuses. They say, "Well, of course it didn't work. He must be a Jew, so you can't touch him. He's invincible or something." But anyways, and of course, while they're talking is the time in verse 14 when he has to still go to this banquet. He's been humiliated, and apparently tried to be humbled, and now he's been sent to this banquet to go be with Esther. So whenever the king and Esther go back to drink wine with the queen, or rather King and Haman go back to drink wine with Queen Esther in verse 1 of chapter 7. On the second day, as they drank their wine at the banquet, he asks, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commiserate with the annoyance to the king." The king Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? Who would presume to do thus?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy is the wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. So he says, the king doesn't know who Esther is. He doesn't know what her background is. And so he asks, or she asks, "Can you save us? Somebody wants to destroy my people." And he said, "Who is it? We'll get him." He said, "Well, it's wicked Haman." And now Haman is terrified before the king and the queen. Now the king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" So he perceived what Haman was doing is trying to get after the queen. And so as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbonal, one of the king's eunuchs who were before the king, said, Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, Hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's anger subsided. So this has just all fallen apart for Haman. He goes into this banquet. He's already devastated at what he had to do earlier that day with Mordecai, parading him around the streets in the best clothes and on the best horse with the best crown. And he goes to this banquet, and he's listening to Esther. And, you know, surely whenever Esther said, someone wants to destroy me and my people, at first he must have been thinking, oh no, is she about to say what I think she's about to say? And of course she says, it's Haman that's done this. I'm a Jew. And Haman, he just goes crazy. He's falling all over Esther, literally trying to get her to forgive him. And when the king comes back in and sees this, he perceives this as being, you know, just, he's trying to commit some sort of disastrous thing against Esther and himself. And one of the eunuchs says, hey, look, there's some gallows over there at Haman's house that he wanted to put Mordecai on, the one that you've blessed. So they must not have liked Haman much anyways, to so quickly offer up this, you know, this route of punishment. And so they put Haman on his own gallows that he intended for Mordecai. Now, all of this was done. The Jews were saved from this slaughter because of the actions of one person, Queen Esther. You know, without her willingness to step up to the plate and to put her life on the line in order to save not only herself and Mordecai, but the entire Jewish people, then they would not have, well, deliverance would come from another place, but it looked as if there was no hope for the Jews at that point. And so God was able to use this young woman to overcome to overcome this threat that was against the people, and to, you know, push her people on forward through history. And in fact, the feast day, as we mentioned last week, was celebrated even in New Testament times by Jesus, commemorating her actions and the act of redemption that she played for Israel.
Well, the interesting thing about it is, I guess as we go on, I might not make this comment because we haven't gotten there yet.
Okay. What were you?
There's something really interesting about that decree.
Oh, the counter decree he's about to make?
The decree that Haman, with the king's permission, had made about destroying the Jews. It's very interesting because even though, you see, the king kind of regret it, he couldn't take it back. Right?
That's right, because the law of the Medes and Persians was unchangeable. Right? Let's see. All right, let's keep going then. In chapter, Lonnie, did you have your hand?
I was going to, another, what's his name? I think it was John McAfee. That's another holiday that they celebrate. Is anything about that holiday in the New Testament about being celebrated?
Yeah, it is, and let me find it real quick.
Okay.
But it is.
I never really paid attention to that.
Yeah, they celebrated it. I want to say it's in the book of John, but let me pull it up. Does somebody have it already? I want to say it's in the book of John, but I can't.
I never paid attention to it.
Right, let's see. John chapter 5 is what it says. Right, so I was thinking John 7, but John 7 must be the Feast of Tabernacles. But we'll get to that towards the end of the lesson, once we get to the initiation of that feast. So in chapter 8, we have, you know, another change of events. You know, something even better. Now Haman wouldn't be able to appreciate this since he was dead, but Mordecai ended up being promoted in chapter 8. Beginning in verse 1, the scripture says, on that day King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had disclosed what he was to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Wow, that had to hurt, right? Then Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, wept and implored him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite, and his plot which he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, so Esther arose and stood before the king. Then she said, "If it pleases the king, and I have found favor before him, and the manner seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the calamity which will befall my people, and how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?" So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews." And then he goes into verse 8, and he says, "Now you write to the Jews as you see fit, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, and for a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked." So here the point again is made that the laws of the Medes and Persians could not be revoked. Once it was made, you couldn't change it. But what Mordecai does in verse 9 and following is he brings about this command that the Jews would be able to defend themselves. And so in verse 11, the scripture says that in them the king granted the Jews who are in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. So this law was sent out into all the country, and now they're able to defend themselves on this day of slaughter. In verse 15 and through 17, we have Mordecai going out before the king's presence of the king in the royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. So here we have this feast that's now being initiated in verse 17. The scripture says that in each and every province, in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the people of the land, here's something for you, many among the people of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. So this act of deliverance even brought about many proselytes. Man, my voice is scratchy today. I don't know what's going on. So, in chapter 9 is when this takes place, where the Jews destroy their enemies in verse 5. And it goes through some of the details of that. But finally, we have in chapter 8, chapter 9 and verse 18, that the Jews gather together for another feast in verses 18 and 19. And then in verse 20, we have this feast of Purim that's instituted. Let's read here in verse 20 and following. We're kind of running out of time. What we might actually do is come back to the feast of Purim next week, since we've run out of time. And I wanted to finish this up today, but we'll just knock off the tail end of this at the start of the next class before we get into talk about Abraham next week. All right? So we'll do that then and take a break now. Okay? Does anybody have any comments or questions before we close? All right.
We got done, but we got a pail.
Do what? What'd you say?
I said really got done, but we got a pail.
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to go get some water. Jaden might have to preach for me. haven't felt bad. I mean, I still don't feel bad. My throat's just scratchy. Yeah, I guess I can get one here. Maybe I played too much with Holly and Perm.
Oh, that could be. How are they?
Yeah, they're doing well. They haven't woken me up at 4:30 one time.
You know, they don't need either. It's funny.
I-
They sleep until like 5:30.
Yeah. They don't wake me up like they do Gary.
Well, I think that Gary's training them to wake up at 3:30.
Oh.
No, I'm just saying, no, I think they got into the habit of him.
Is it an E or an A?
Looks like you needed a new marker.
Oh, my brother said no. Yes, right.